What if I told you the deadliest African warriors never held a sword? Across the vast landscapes of the continent, from the forests of Igboland to the savannas of the Sahel, battles were not only fought with spears, arrows, or iron blades. There were warriors who carried no shield of leather, no metal forged in fire, yet they struck fear into enemies and commanded respect that outlasted generations. Their arsenal was not steel but spirit, not iron but incantation. The question is, how could someone fight without ever lifting a weapon? This is where the world of African spiritual warfare begins. For centuries, people turned to unseen powers that governed life and death, believing that the true battleground was not on the earth, but in the realm beyond human sight. These weapons were not myths or stories meant to frighten children. They were practical, tested, and deeply respected systems of defense and protection. Communities understood that before a war was won in the body, it was first won in the spirit. To go to battle without spiritual fortification was to walk into certain defeat. But what were these mysterious weapons? Could charms stitched into a warrior's garment really stop an arrow? Could words sung in rhythm actually disarm an enemy? Could an object as simple as a carved staff, known as Ofo, deliver justice stronger than any judge or executioner? These are not just legends preserved in the whispers of elders. They were lived realities, tools so powerful that even colonizers and invaders feared them. To call them spiritual weapons is not to speak in riddles or metaphors. These forces shaped the laws of societies, defended communities against threats, and punished wrongdoers with a precision that no sword could match. Charms could cloak a warrior in protection. Incantations could weaken an enemy before a spear was even lifted, and Ofo and Ogu became instruments of truth, binding entire societies to the cosmic laws of justice. What makes this story even more powerful is that these weapons were not only for warriors or priests. They were woven into the daily lives of people, reminding everyone that true strength lay not in muscles or iron, but in alignment with the unseen forces of the universe. To understand the ancestors' weapons is to understand how Africa saw the world, as a place where spirit and matter were one battlefield, and where victory belonged to those who knew how to command both. To understand how the ancestors fought without swords, we must first grasp the philosophy that guided their worldview. African metaphysics does not imagine the universe as a random collection of disconnected things. Instead, it sees creation as a living, breathing web where every thread touches another. Mountains speak to rivers, rivers speak to forests, forests speak to people, and people speak to the ancestors. And in this vision, nothing exists in isolation. A broken oath, a curse, or an act of injustice could ripple outward, disturbing not just one family, but the balance of an entire community. Harmony was not merely a moral aspiration, it was the very condition for survival. This interconnected view of the universe shaped how Africans conceived of conflict, justice, and power. At the heart of this worldview was the conviction that spirit precedes matter. What appears in the physical world is only the echo of what has already been set in motion in the unseen. A battle was never just an exchange of weapons or brute strength. It was first an alignment of forces: spiritual, ancestral, and cosmic. To fight without consulting the spirits was to march blindly into defeat. This is why warriors were fortified with rituals, why diviners were consulted before any major decision, and why no kingdom dared to ignore its priests, medicine men, or spiritual custodians. They understood that the body could be protected only if the spirit had already secured the victory. This principle extended far beyond the battlefield. Farmers sought blessings for their crops because they knew that fertility began in the unseen. Kings performed rituals before enthronement because governance without spiritual backing was considered illegitimate.
Marriage, childbirth, and burial rites all operated on the same logic. Matter follows spirit, never the other way around. Life itself was read as a constant negotiation with forces both visible and invisible. Warfare then was never just physical, it was cosmological. To wage war was to disturb the order of things, and so it could not be approached recklessly. Enemies were not simply human rivals, they were seen as manifestations of disharmony in the cosmic order. Thus, before striking with spears or arrows, communities struck first in the realm of spirit. Charms, incantations, libations, and sacrifices were not superstitions. They were strategies to shift the unseen currents of power in their favor. A single incantation could be thought to confuse the enemy, turning their weapons against them. A ritual could weaken an invading army before it even crossed the border. To ignore this unseen dimension was to misunderstand the very nature of conflict itself. This cosmological understanding also reframed the meaning of victory. It was not enough to conquer an enemy physically if the spiritual imbalance that gave rise to conflict remained unresolved. A war could be won on the field and yet lost in the long arc of time if ancestral forces were offended or if justice was denied. Victory had to restore harmony, otherwise it was incomplete. This is why oaths, treaties, and spiritual reconciliations were as critical as the clash of armies. The real triumph was not just the subjugation of an opponent, but the reweaving of the cosmic web. To modern ears, this may sound abstract, but to the ancestors, it was practical knowledge. Just as today's generals study logistics, supply lines, and strategies, African societies studied the currents of spirit, the moods of ancestors, and the alignment of forces beyond the human eye. The unseen world was the original battlefield, and only when it was secured could swords or spears play their part. A soldier's courage mattered, but his unseen protection mattered even more. In this sense, every battle was both human and divine, earthly and cosmic. When we begin to see the world through this lens, the mystery of Africa's spiritual weapons becomes clearer. They were never mere rituals performed out of habit. They were the highest expression of a worldview where all things are connected and where power flows first from the spirit before it manifests in flesh. To fight was not only to defend territory, but to defend the very balance of creation. This was the philosophy that made charms potent, incantations effective, and ancestral justice undeniable. It was not magic in the sense of trickery. It was a science of the unseen, a recognition that the cosmos itself could be mobilized as an ally in war. In this light, Africa's greatest warriors were not simply the men who wielded spears, but the custodians of knowledge who understood how to align with the deepest currents of reality. They were men and women who knew that to defeat an enemy, one must first conquer the disorder in the unseen. And it was this philosophy, the inseparability of spirit and matter, that gave birth to a tradition of warfare far more powerful, far more enduring than any sword could ever be. When the ancestors prepared for battle, their first defense was often not the shield made of wood or the sword forged from iron. Their protection began with objects imbued with spiritual force, charms, amulets, and sacred items designed to guard the body and spirit against harm. These objects, known by many names across the continent, were considered living vessels of power. To carry one was to carry more than an ornament. It was to bear the blessing of ancestors, the energy of nature, and the authority of the unseen. A warrior clothed with charms stepped into the battlefield, already armored in ways no spear could pierce. The making of such charms was never casual. It required the wisdom of herbalists, the insight of diviners, and the authority of priests
who understood how to bridge the visible and invisible realms. Herbs were carefully chosen for their spiritual as well as medicinal qualities. Animal parts were selected for their symbolic strength, and sacred words were spoken over each component. When bound together, the charm became more than the sum of its parts. It became a shield crafted out of the laws of the cosmos itself. Warriors who wore them were believed to be invisible to danger, untouchable by weapons, or immune to curses sent by enemies. Among the most fascinating examples of this practice are the hunters' shirts of West Africa, stitched from simple cloth yet covered in layers of inscriptions, leather patches, and symbolic designs. These garments were more than clothing. Each symbol carried meaning. Each word inscribed upon them carried force. Some bore verses from sacred texts. Others bore markings unique to indigenous traditions, but all shared the same function: to create a spiritual armor around the one who wore it. When a hunter entered the forest or a warrior went to war, the shirts declared to the unseen world that he was not alone. He was accompanied by powers beyond human comprehension. The science behind these consecrated objects was not guesswork. It was a body of knowledge refined across generations based on the belief that every material thing carries a vibration, and every vibration can be aligned to specific intentions. By invoking the right forces through ritual, the ordinary could be transformed into the extraordinary. A stone became a weapon of protection. A feather became a channel for speed. A simple knot tied with the correct words became an unbreakable bond of safety. These were not trinkets of superstition. They were technologies of spirit, as real and precise in their logic as any system of weaponry. What made charms even more powerful was the element of secrecy. Not every warrior knew what had been bound into his protection. The knowledge was often kept between the maker and the spirit invoked. This secrecy added to the mystique of the weapon, making enemies hesitant, fearful, and often psychologically defeated before the clash even began. If you believed your opponent could not be touched by your sword, you fought with a trembling hand. Thus, the charm worked on both planes, spiritually in the unseen and psychologically in the minds of those who opposed it. The use of charms and amulets was not limited to warriors alone. Entire communities wore them as protection against plague, drought, or invasion. Mothers placed charms over their children to ward off sickness. Farmers tied them to the corners of their fields to invite abundance and drive away destructive spirits. Kings carried them as symbols of legitimacy and divine favor. In each case, the object acted as a bridge between human effort and divine power, ensuring that survival and prosperity were never dependent on human strength alone. It is important to understand that these objects were never seen as inherently powerful on their own. A piece of cloth was only cloth until it was spoken over, consecrated, and aligned with the forces of nature and spirit. Power came from the ritual, from the intention, and from the relationship between humans, nature, and the ancestors. This is why the role of herbalists, diviners, and priests was indispensable. They were not simply craftsmen, but custodians of cosmic knowledge, able to awaken the hidden energies of the world and direct them toward protection. Even today, echoes of this tradition remain. Across Africa, hunters still wear consecrated shirts, priests still prepare charms for protection, and families still keep sacred objects in their homes. These practices endure because they are built on a philosophy that refuses to separate the spiritual from the physical. Just as modern soldiers wear helmets and body armor, the ancestors wore their charms and amulets. The difference is that the armor extended beyond flesh to shield the very soul. Charms and amulets were, in essence, Africa's invisible shields. They carried within them a philosophy of war and survival that transcended mere steel. They remind us that power is not always what can be seen or touched. Sometimes the greatest weapon is the unseen force carried close to the heart, consecrated by ritual and sustained by belief. For the ancestors, such weapons did not just guard the body, they protected the spirit, defended the community, and declared to the universe that victory was already written before the battle began. If charms and amulets served as shields for the body, then the spoken word was the sword of the spirit. Across Africa, language was never treated as a simple tool of communication. Words carried weight, breath carried power, and sound carried force. To speak was to create, to chant was to command, and to sing was to summon. The ancestors believed that every syllable vibrated with energy, and when released with intention, it could shape events in both the visible and invisible worlds. This was the foundation of incantations, war songs, and chants, the recognition that the tongue was as mighty as the spear. In times of conflict, warriors did not rush into battle in silence. They moved to rhythm, voices raised in unison, chanting phrases that stirred courage within themselves and sowed fear into the hearts of enemies. A war song was not mere performance, it was an invocation. Each drumbeat echoed the heartbeat of the earth. Each repeated phrase opened a channel to the unseen, and each chorus bound the fighters together as one spirit moving through many bodies. By the time warriors clashed, the battle had already been charged with sound that bent reality in their favor. Incantations operated with an even more precise intention. Priests, diviners, and elders recited words that had been passed down for generations, words believed to carry the very essence of power. Some incantations invoked ancestral protection, others confused the minds of enemies, and still others cloaked warriors in invisibility. It was said that a skilled speaker could tie the tongue of an opponent, making them stumble in speech and lose their courage before a fight began. Such was the trust in the potency of language that entire battles could be decided without a single blow, as the side with stronger words bent the unseen forces of reality toward victory. The potency of the spoken word was deeply tied to Africa's oral traditions. Stories, proverbs, chants, and prayers were more than cultural expressions. They were reservoirs of power. To recite a story of ancestral triumph before battle was to summon that same spirit of triumph into the present. To declare a proverb was to invoke a cosmic law that even enemies could not ignore. Oral traditions carried not just memory but vibration, and vibration was itself a weapon. Just as a modern general deploys soldiers with strategy, the ancestors deployed words with precision, knowing that the resonance could shift the outcome of the events. The science behind this practice lies in the understanding of vibrations and frequency. Everything in existence, from stones to stars, was believed to vibrate at its own rhythm. The human voice, when aligned with intention and ritual, could harmonize with or disrupt these rhythms. A chant could heighten courage by aligning a warrior's spirit with the heartbeat of the earth. A curse could weaken an enemy by dissonantly clashing with their energy. Songs could confuse, chants could embolden, and incantations could alter the very atmosphere of battle. To the ancestors, this was not metaphor but reality. Sound was force, and force could be directed. Even outside of warfare, the spoken word remained a weapon of immense importance. Disputes were settled through oaths sworn aloud, where the power of speech bound individuals to truth under the watchful eyes of spirit. Blessings were spoken into newborns to shape their destinies. Funerary chants ensured a safe passage for the departed.
In every aspect of life, words were vessels of energy that moved between worlds. To misuse them was to invite disaster, for once released, words could not be recalled. When we see incantations, songs, and chants in this light, they cease to be curiosities of culture and reveal themselves as deliberate technologies of sound. They remind us that the human voice is not powerless air, but a current of vibration that can shape reality. For the ancestors to go into battle without song was unthinkable. To speak without intention was dangerous. To chant with alignment was to command the forces of creation itself. Thus, the spoken word stood as one of Africa's most enduring spiritual weapons. It uplifted communities, empowered warriors, confused enemies, and harmonized the cosmos with human will. In the roar of a war song, in the precision of an incantation, in the steady rhythm of a chant, the ancestors wielded the power greater than steel. The power of sound itself, bound forever to the laws of spirit and the vibrations of the universe. In the armory of Africa's spiritual weapons, none carried the same gravity as Ofo and Ogu. These were not swords that cut flesh, nor shields that blocked arrows, but instruments that wielded truth as their blade and justice as their shield. In Igbo cosmology, Ofo symbolized divine authority, a staff of power that embodied moral rectitude and ancestral witness. Ogu, its counterpart, represented the principle of innocence, the assurance that one who stood with clean hands could call upon the unseen forces of justice and be defended. Together, Ofo and Ogu functioned as spiritual courts, binding communities not by fear of prisons or written laws, but by reverence for truth itself. The presence of Ofo in a community was more than symbolic. It was the physical embodiment of justice, often fashioned as a carved wooden staff, sometimes adorned with sacred materials, and always consecrated through ritual. When held aloft, it declared that the ancestors themselves were present in judgment. Disputes that could not be resolved by argument or negotiation were taken before Ofo, and once it was invoked, no one dared to speak falsely. To lie in its presence was to invite curses that could outlive the liar and fall upon their lineage. The ancestors were considered active guardians of morality, and Ofo was the instrument through which they enforced their will. Individuals too could invoke Ofo and Ogu in their personal defense. A man wrongfully accused of theft or betrayal might swear an oath upon Ofo, declaring his innocence. If he spoke the truth, he would be vindicated. But if he lied, the spiritual forces bound to Ofo would eventually expose him, often through misfortune, illness, or even death. In this way, truth was weaponized, not through violence, but through cosmic law. One did not need to raise a sword to defend oneself. Aligning with truth was a defense enough, for it summoned the might of the unseen. The collective reliance on Ofo and Ogu created the moral framework that discouraged corruption and oppression. Chiefs, elders, and rulers were not above the law of Ofo. In fact, they were bound to it more tightly than anyone else. A corrupt leader could be challenged by the community through an appeal to Ofo, and if found guilty in the eyes of spirit, he would lose legitimacy and authority. In this way, Ofo served not only as a court, but as a balancing force, preventing the concentration of unchecked power. The ruler who ignored Ofo did so at great peril, for the ancestors were seen as impartial guardians who punished arrogance as swiftly as they punished lies. Real-life accounts testify to the potency of this weapon. There are stories of communities that resisted external oppressors, not by raising armies but by swearing collective oaths upon Ofo, declaring their innocence and calling down curses upon those who sought to exploit them. Invaders who ignored these oaths often found themselves plagued by mysterious misfortunes, illnesses, or unrest that made conquest impossible.
Colonial administrators who dismissed Ofo as primitive superstition were bewildered when entire villages stood united in fearless defiance, protected not by guns but by their unwavering faith in ancestral justice. For the people, Ofo was not an artifact of culture. It was a shield forged in truth. In family disputes, Ofo brought resolution without endless cycles of revenge. If two brothers quarreled over land, the matter could be settled by invoking Ofo. Whoever swore falsely would face spiritual retribution, ensuring that justice prevailed without the spilling of blood. This system preserved harmony, for it eliminated the need for violence by placing the final judgment in the hands of the ancestors. It was believed that while human judges could be bribed or swayed, Ofo could never be deceived. In this way, truth itself became the most reliable weapon of all. The moral authority of Ofo and Ogu extended far beyond the courtroom or village square. They cultivated a culture where honesty, integrity, and innocence were understood as shields against harm. A person who carried Ogu, who was innocent of wrongdoing, walked through the world with a quiet but unshakable confidence. No enemy's curse could harm them. No plot could prevail. For the ancestors stood on the side of the pure in heart. Thus, morality itself became a weapon, more enduring than steel, more potent than poison. When we reflect on this, we see that Ofo and Ogu were not just tools of justice but also instruments of spiritual warfare. They disarmed enemies not by striking them down, but by exposing the corruption within their hearts. They created order without armies, safeguarded truth without violence, and preserved community without oppression. In a world where physical weapons could destroy bodies, Ofo and Ogu defended the soul of society itself. These instruments remind us of a deeper truth, that the greatest defense is righteousness, and the greatest weapon is justice. The ancestors understood that a society armed with Ofo and Ogu was stronger than one armed with 1,000 spears. To fight with truth was to fight with the universe at one side, and no enemy, however powerful, could prevail against that. In this way, Ofo and Ogu remain among the most profound spiritual weapons ever wielded in Africa, standing as eternal testaments to the power of justice over oppression and truth over deceit. To the ancestors, no battle was ever fought by the living alone. Behind every warrior stood a lineage of spirits stretching back through generations, each one carrying the memory, strength, and wisdom of those who had walked the earth before. These ancestors were not gone. They were active allies, watching over their descendants and intervening when the balance of life was threatened. In times of war or conflict, their presence was not symbolic but literal. A hidden army that marched alongside the living, unseen yet undeniably felt. Ancestral veneration was therefore far more than ritual. It was a protection system, a way of ensuring that no person faced danger without the shield of their lineage. Libations poured at shrines, prayers spoken at dawn, and sacrifices made in honor of the departed were not acts of nostalgia but strategic alliances. By maintaining a relationship with the ancestors, communities secured a defense stronger than walls or fortresses. It was believed that a warrior who fought with ancestral backing could not easily fall, for their shield extended into realms the enemy could not touch. This belief in ancestral intervention often revealed itself in dreams and visions. Before battles, warriors would sleep and receive instructions in the dream state, warnings of ambushes, strategies for victory, or signs of protection. Elders taught that the dream world was not illusion, but another battlefield, a place where the ancestors whispered secrets and shifted outcomes before they manifested in daylight. Victories were sometimes credited not to the strength of the warrior's arms, but to the clarity of the visions that guided them. In this way, dreams became as important as weapons,
and visions were treated as maps of survival. There are countless accounts of unseen interventions, where warriors claim to see ancestral figures appear in moments of danger, deflecting weapons or giving them supernatural courage. Others spoke of hearing voices in the heat of battle, voices that directed them to safety or gave them the strength to stand when all seemed lost. These experiences were not dismissed as imagination, but embraced as proof that warfare was larger than the visible struggle. It was a cosmic conflict in which the living were never alone. Cosmic warfare then was the recognition that every battle rippled beyond the physical world. To fight was to summon not just the strength of one's body, but the weight of one's lineage and the power of the unseen. The ancestors were the eternal generals, guiding, shielding, and ensuring that the legacy of a people endured. In this way, warfare became not simply a contest of armies, but a collaboration between the living and the dead, united in the defense of harmony, justice, and survival. When we look back on the long story of African resistance, it becomes clear that the ancestors placed more trust in spirit than in steel. This was not because they lacked weapons of iron or skill in battle, but because they knew that physical power alone could never guarantee lasting victory. Swords could be broken, shields could be pierced, but the spirit, once aligned with truth and ancestral power, could not be conquered. For them, spiritual weapons mattered more than swords because they struck at the root of conflict, shaping reality before a single blow was exchanged. Even colonizers armed with guns and cannons recognized and feared this metaphysical strength. They may have dismissed charms as superstition and incantations as meaningless chants, but history records how deeply unsettled they were by the unwavering faith of African communities in their unseen defenses. Soldiers and administrators spoke of villages where no bullet seemed to land, of warriors who fought with unshakable courage, and of communities that resisted conquest through nothing more than their unity in ritual and prayer. The colonizers' fear was not simply of rebellion, but of the unknown powers they could not explain or control. This same spiritual resilience carried into the liberation struggles of the 20th century. Across the continent, freedom fighters invoked the blessings of ancestors, carried protective charms into battle, and sang war songs that turned fear into resolve. Though colonial regimes wielded superior firepower, they could not extinguish the conviction that the unseen world stood on the side of justice. Spiritual warfare became both shield and fuel, binding fighters together in the belief that the cause was sanctified by higher forces. The ancestors trusted spirit over steel because they knew that empires crumble, but truth endures. Their legacy teaches that real power flows not from weapons of destruction, but from alignment with the forces that shape destiny itself. The journey through Africa's spiritual weapons reveals something far deeper than charms, incantations, or sacred staffs. It reveals a philosophy of life where spirit and matter were never divided, where truth itself was a defense, and where sound, memory, and justice were as sharp as any sword. These were not relics of superstition, but sciences of survival, tested and refined by generations who understood that the greatest wars are fought not only on earth, but in the realms that lie beyond human sight. To call them spiritual weapons is to recognize that they were tools of both protection and creation, binding communities together and ensuring that harmony could prevail over chaos. These weapons endure not as fading stories but as a living memory. In the chants still sung by hunters, in the charms still worn by children, in the oaths still sworn upon sacred objects, the echoes of this knowledge remain. They remind us that Africa was never defenseless, never voiceless, never powerless. Long before colonial armies marched in,
long before foreign religions declared dominance, Africans wielded arsenals that no empire could fully extinguish. The survival of these traditions is proof of their strength, for they were carried not in steel but in spirit, and spirit cannot be colonized. Today, as Africa and its diaspora continue to search for meaning, identity, and power in a world that often seeks to erase indigenous wisdom, these weapons rise again with a renewed relevance. To reclaim them is not to romanticize the past, but to understand how ancient sciences can guide the present. In a world filled with injustice, Ofo and Ogu still remind us that truth is unbreakable. In times of fear, incantations and songs remind us that sound can heal and protect. In moments of conflict, the ancestors remind us that we never fight alone. This is the inheritance of Africa's children, a legacy of spiritual warfare that is as much philosophy as it is practice, as much cosmic science as it is cultural memory. To embrace it is to walk with the strength of generations, to see beyond the surface of reality, and to know that victory is always first secured in the unseen. If this awakens something in you, subscribe for more journeys into the wisdom of Africa's ancestors. Like this video if you believe indigenous knowledge deserves to be honored and remembered. Share it so that more people can reconnect with the truths that colonization tried to silence. And above all, subscribe, because the journey into Africa's hidden wisdom is far from over. And together we can keep these fires burning for generations yet to come.